unlocking your world of creativity with best-selling author and brand innovator, Mark Stinson. This episode is brought to you by White Cloud Coffee Roasters, nestled in the heart of Idaho's mountain wilderness, where every bean tells a story of adventure. Discover the difference in their premium beans, meticulously roasted to capture the essence of the mountains. Now, listeners of our podcast can get an exclusive 10% discount. Just use the promo code CREATIVITY at checkout. Visit whitecloudcoffee.com and use the code CREATIVITY.
Well, welcome back, friends, to our podcast, Your World of Creativity. This is the podcast where we dive into the minds of creators really around the globe. Authors, singer-songwriters, inventors, restaurateurs, interior designers. We want to explore their inspirations, how they organize their ideas, and most important, how we gain the confidence and the connections to launch our work out into the world. And today we've got a fascinating guest and a great story that blends investigative reporting with a human storytelling and a kind of a controversy and a environmental tale. There's a lot going on in this. And my guest is Amy Gamerman. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark.
Amy was a longtime contributor to the Wall Street Journal's Mansion section, which I always enjoyed, Amy. I perhaps didn't know you by name and byline, but I enjoyed the articles. And now you've authored your first book called The Crazies, and the subtitle, The Cattleman, The Wind Prospector, and a War Out West. It's just released from Simon Schuster. Amy, what a great combination of journalism and novel writing this book is.
Thank you. That is such a compliment. I wanted it to be a nonfiction book that would read like a novel. So that's lovely to hear.
There's so many clues right from even the introductory page. There's a prologue. You even had a note here. I have to tell you, this is a work of nonfiction. You're not going to believe it when you start reading it because it reads like a novel.
Yes, absolutely. It is all true. It is scrupulously researched. And that was really important to me, that the reporting be as deep as it could be. But then when it came to writing this story, the characters were all so extraordinary and larger than life. And the story was so amazing that I wanted the reader to be immersed in this world. And the way to do that was by almost putting you in the heads of each of these different remarkable, crazy people, whether that was a fifth generation crotchety old rancher or a Texas oil and gas billionaire or a Crow Indian activist or a lawyer who'd been an Olympian, an Olympic rower. I really wanted to put the reader in their heads and to see what the stakes were for each one of these people.
Mm-hmm. And what a great backdrop, the setting in Montana's a big timber country. And I'm out here in Idaho myself, so I get the scale and scope of the big sky happening here.
Yes. Yes. Everything is different out west. The quality of the light is different. Like the sky is bigger. There is just, it's a different way of being and relating to the landscape when you're there, as opposed to being in Connecticut, which is where I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, a different field, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Let's get into the ideas here. Certainly an overlap and collision of tradition and innovation, identity, that kind of Western culture that you're talking about. But what really started as a real estate story unfolded into this. Maybe you can give us a sense of the journey of the story itself.
Absolutely. I was so intrigued by the nature of your podcast, like exploring the nature of creativity and what is creativity. How does it begin? And for me, the creation of this book began with a question, a curiosity. I was in Montana for the Wall Street Journal writing a profile of a Texas oil and gas billionaire who collects ranches the way other rich men collect artwork. He has an extraordinary collection of trophy ranches across the West. And we were touring his Montana ranch, not far from Big Timber in the Crazy Mountains, which is an isolated mountain range in the Rockies. And he happened to mention that the rancher just over his borderline was planning to lease his land for a wind farm. And his whole face darkened as he described these towering windmills that were going to go up within sight of his beautiful gem of a ranch. And I asked him, semi-joking, semi-not, why don't you try to buy him out? And he said, I have. And the man's not interested. He said, I'm doing that wind farm. I went back to, I went back home. I wrote my story. And I would just find myself thinking about this. But it just stayed in my mind. It was like, who is that rancher? Who was that guy? And what is it like to say no to someone like this powerful billionaire and to say no to his money? And what happened? Did he build his wind farm? And it was something that I would think of from time to time. It was a question that would just poke at me. And finally, one summer, I happened to be sitting at my computer with not a lot to do, and I did a random Google search. And sure enough, I found that a wind farm or a proposed wind farm near Big Timber, Montana, was the subject of a lawsuit. And that the lawsuit involved some of the wealthiest people in America who
Mm.
all happened to own ranches that adjoined the property of a struggling fifth generation cowpoke named Rick Jarrett, who wanted to lease his land for wind development, not because he believed in renewable energy or even because he believed in climate change, because he didn't, but because he wanted the royalties that the wind energy would provide, and in fact was looking for a way to bring in an additional income source to keep his ranch in the family.
So fantastic that it all comes full circle. Or environmental. You're right.
Yeah. And it's funny, even it took me 5 years to do this book, the reporting and the writing of it. And over the years that I was spending in when I would go out there, you were seeing the signs of a changing climate. It was getting drier. The wildfire season was extending into every part of the year. It was affecting cattle ranchers and how many cows they could run on their land because they couldn't grow enough hay to feed their livestock. So all of this stuff was intruding on the reality of these folks in a way that I could not have predicted when I began writing this book.
Hmm. And the tapestry of characters that you're describing, like you said, from the Crow Indian activist, the Texas oil tycoon, an Olympic athlete turned attorney, all of these characters also had their own voices, but the fact that you were able to turn them from just here's the names and places of the story into this narrative, that was the part of the novel writing I was intrigued by.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, it's this very extraordinary little corner of the world. The Crazy Mountains are a mountain range that are cloaked in myth. They're very beautiful, they're very remote. They're almost completely inaccessible because the mountains are, for the most part, privately owned.
Mhm.
Now, I didn't know that you could own a mountain. I thought like that was just not something, it was like sounded like owning a golden eagle or something. You just can't
Right.
do that. But in fact, all across the West, there are privately owned mountains that very wealthy people have bought for their own pleasure. And it just so happens that in the Crazy Mountains, so much of the public land that's there is locked up behind giant swaths of privately owned land. So you have this very beautiful, kind of awe-inspiring mountain range that's there, and you live with it every day. You see it from every viewpoint, but it's also like a strange mirage because it's so hard to get in there. And for the Crow Indian people, in particular, whose land this all was for centuries and centuries, the Crazies had a really important central role in their most sacred kind of belief system. The Crazies were where you would go to experience a vision and a life-changing vision. And you would go to the highest peak. You would climb to the top of Crazy Peak and you would lie down on a bed of stones and you would go without water or food for days. And you would, if you were lucky, have a great dream. And this dream would give you wisdom or give you special, almost supernatural abilities to take back with you. So you have the Crow people who are not only pushed off the land more than a century ago, but they're also cut off from this incredibly important part of their culture. It's like their Notre Dame, it's their cathedral, and they can't get to it either.
Hmm.
So the mountains are this very beautiful thing that means something different for all the different people in this story. There are some people that own part of that landscape and see it as like this, almost like a cross between an investment and like a personal treasury of beautiful land for them to enjoy. And then you have the people like my rancher who are depending on those mountains and the snow that is in those mountains to trickle down and irrigate their fields. Like that snowpack is their water source. So it was just fascinating to me how it could mean so many different things to so many different people and how
Yes.
they could all value it so much that they would get into such a big fight like the one that they did.
And this is really how the conflict, the tradition versus innovation, or the let's keep the things the way they are versus let's embrace change. All of these themes are recurring throughout the book, aren't they?
Yes, very much so. You can love a place to death. How do you love the land? What is the best way to love the land? Is it to keep it the way it is and never change anything on it? Or is it to maybe make adaptations so that the land can stay in agricultural use? Maybe if you want to keep running cows, which most people seem to think are picturesque, people don't have a problem looking at cows on the range.
Right.
But if you want those ranchers who've owned those ranches for generations to be able to stay there, they're going to need to do something else to supplement their income to make that land work for them and to be sustainable. And then there's the third piece of it, which is like the earth, which we all share, and it's changing climate. And what do we have to do if we really love the planet that we're sitting on? What is that asking of us to do to ensure that it is there for our future generations?
Yes. As we're talking here, Amy, I'd love to give our listeners a sense of the style of the writing. We wondered if you could read an excerpt from the book for us.
I would love to. So I'll just read a little bit. I am going to read an introduction to Rick Jarrett, who's the rancher at the very heart of this book and of this conflict. And Rick is the person whose ancestors had arrived in Montana on covered wagons and had been there ever since. And he wanted this ranch to be there for his grandchildren. That was his thing. Okay. I will read to you about Rick Jarrett. Rick was a rancher. He never had the imagination to be anything else, he said. His people had ranched in big timber since 1882. Cattle first, then sheep, then cattle and some sheep. Any Montanan who makes his living off livestock will tell you that what he really does is raise grass. Rick raised fields of alfalfa and orchard grass and timothy hay and forage winter wheat to be cut and baled for the long winters. When spring came in April or May, he'd turn the calves and the mother cows out on fresh green grass. Everything came in cycles on a ranch, just as it had for Rick's grandparents and his great-grandparents. Being a rancher meant knowing how to do things, how to brand a calf, dock a lamb, break a colt, mending a barbed wire fence, cleaning out a clogged irrigation ditch so the water could flow clear and cold to your hay fields, knowing when to cut the hay and how many days to let it cure in the sun before you baled it. Those were essential skills, along with a basic grasp of cattle futures, soil science, and veterinary medicine. You preg-checked your cows by sticking your arm up the rectum and giving a squeeze. If a calf got stuck in a heifer's birth canal, you'd loop a chain over its fetlock and slowly tug it free. Then you'd get some suture thread from the floor of your truck and stitch up the torn mother cow. Not every calf lived. Not every heifer survived. You saw a lot of death on the ranch. So you adapted. You'd skin the dead calf, then tie its pelt to the orphan, fooling the bereaved bovine into suckling it like it was her own. It took a lifetime to acquire such knowledge. Rick could kill a rattlesnake with a rock or a rein, drive a fence post, cook beef goulash. If it busted, he fixed it. Rick always had a bit of wire or baling twine on hand if a gate didn't hook right or his suspender snapped under the strain. When his tractor sputtered or the muffler fell off his 1987 Cadillac Brougham, he'd scavenge a spare part from one of the many junked vehicles that dotted his land. To be a rancher was to be a master of the workaround, to make do with what you had and get on with it. This was called ranching it. The corollary to ranching it was that your ranch looked like because you never threw anything away. Rick's Ranch was an open-air museum of historic farm machinery in various stages of decay, with the serrated white and blue peaks of the Crazy Mountains for a backdrop. He called it the Crazy Mountain Cattle Company. And so that is the reader's introduction to Rick Jarrett.
It is fantastic. And as we've been talking, the balance between a journalistic accuracy and description and a character development description is really on display in your writing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I was talking about the rigor, and you called it reporting, not just book writing. The references and the rigor that you put behind this, I didn't count them, but I assume that there's 50 pages of footnotes and references.
I know,
It's
somewhere between
fantastic.
50 and 100. I'm
It
going to have
is.
to go look it up.
Yes.
Yes. And it was important to me to have as many endnotes because I wanted people to see where I was getting things from. I wanted the reader to be able to go and look and see, maybe get more information about something or see what the source for this outrageous part was. Like that couldn't have happened. That just
Right.
sounds outrageous.
You can't believe it.
Exactly.
There are so many books like this, I guess, highlighting either controversies or controversial viewpoints that don't have that kind of journalistic rigor. It's simply somebody's opinion. And so I am curious why it was so important to you to reference and have these kind of endnotes.
I think that what you're really asking is why it was important to research everything as deeply as I did. And what I found was that you couldn't really tell this story of these people and why their conflict mattered without understanding all of the history that had brought each one of these people to the Crazy Mountains, the unique set of life events that had brought each one of them there, and what it was that the landscape meant to them. And additionally to that, to understand this conflict, you had to see the bigger forces that were at work that went just beyond a kind of clash of personalities. And so doing that required learning an awful lot about everything from geography to pioneer history to green energy to the way regulatory agencies function even.
Yeah.
I had to really, like many people, my eyes glaze over when I read bureaucratic reports from government agencies that regulatory this, regulatory that, blah, 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 and my just glaze over. But I found that I really needed to delve into those worlds because what I found was that there are these very small agencies called public service commissions and every state has one. And they are making profound decisions about how you and I and future generations are going to get their electricity from now for 20 years forward. And looking at why this wind farm was important and obstacles it ran into, I had to really also look at the kind of regulatory hurdles that were there, and also the way that the regulators who were supposed to be enforcing certain policies sometimes chose not to.
And certainly, many people have observed the book really can contribute to this larger conversation about climate change and maybe the conflict with community or regulation or the future. How do you want readers to see that story and see that conflict and maybe take away from the book?
Mainly, I just, number one, I would love people to read it
Of course.
and take whatever you want from it. But first and foremost is I wanted to like give you a really good read, something juicy with crazy characters in it and like outrageous twists and turns. There's everyone from like a mob lawyer from Las Vegas who gets his ranch as a kind of reward to himself, and like he's out there and his world is evoked. Like I wanted to delve into that world of Las Vegas and like coke dealers and showgirls and all of that stuff as part of it. I just wanted it to be almost like a Victorian novel where you just have these rich plot strands and all kinds of really fascinating kind of offbeat people. And as far as what to get from it as like a moral of the story, or I hope it gets people thinking about how hard it is to achieve meaningful change when it comes to climate and so much else, and to look at the visible but also maybe not so visible forces that get in the way and prevent us from doing what needs to be done.
And isn't that what a great book should do? Get us thinking.
We hope. Knock on wood. We hope. Yeah.
Listeners, my guest is Amy Gamerman. Her terrific new book is called The Crazies. Amy, I can't thank you enough for a great conversation about not only the book and the content and the characters, but about your creative process. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been so much fun talking to you, Mark. You're such a good listener. And you ask great questions. By the way, listening is also a form of creativity, I think.
I think so. And it's been long work done. I can't say early in my career that would have been one of my traits.
You're a master of it now. So thank you.
And thanks for sharing these characters, this setting, and the story. And again, folks, the book is The Crazies, just out from Simon & Schuster. I want to thank the folks at Simon & Schuster for helping coordinate this conversation. We're going to put the links in our show notes. It's certainly at your favorite bookstore or online retailer. And for more about Amy's work, we'll have those links and social media handles in the show notes as well.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes.
It's been great.
And before we go, I want to thank our sponsor, White Cloud Coffee Roasters. You can use the code CREATIVITY at checkout for your specialty coffee and get 10% off your order at whitecloudcoffee.com. Until next time, I'm Mark Stinson, inviting you to keep creating, keep innovating, and keep unlocking your world of creativity. We'll see you next time.